We ended last week's study with a quick and maybe too brief move from the reign of Henry VIII into the reign of his son, Edward VI. And we looked at Sir John Cheek's Bible. And what I want to do to begin with this morning, because I think I may have been a little too hasty, I don't want to bog down in politics, but maybe a little too hasty in going from the reign of Henry VIII to the reign of his son, Edward VI. So I want to go back and kind of summarize what we've learned about Henry VIII's reign, and then make some comments of this transition that we have into Edward VI. Now here's a paragraph that I've written down, just brief, and you can write or listen. Henry VIII, because I want to clarify some things. I don't want to leave you with a misunderstanding of Henry VIII's reign. Henry VIII has been called, and maybe rightfully so, the greatest king that England ever had. He's, of course, well known from movie pictures and so forth, but there were many things that did take place during his reign. You know, he reigned for 37 years that had far-reaching consequences for the people of England. And his daughter, Elizabeth, has maybe rightfully been called the greatest queen that England has ever had. So it's quite a dynasty here, Henry and the wives that he has had and the children that he produced, including Edward, including Mary, then including Elizabeth, which will be the next queen toward the end of the 6th decade of the 16th century. But I don't want to leave a misunderstanding about Henry VIII. He was not a person to emulate in morals or in any regard. So in one sense we could say he was a bad king. But as far as the influence he had on England for years to come, just think of his progeny. That goes all the way down to 1603, whenever James comes to the throne after Elizabeth. Then I guess he could be called the greatest English king. Henry VIII was probably influenced by his wives toward a more devout practice of either Protestantism or Catholicism, depending upon the proclivity of the wife in question. And I've said that before. But at heart, he was always a Roman Catholic. See, he didn't switch back and forth himself so much between being a Protestant or being a Catholic. At heart, I think we could argue that Henry VIII was always a Catholic. Whence then his earlier falling out with the Pope? It had less to do with Roman Catholicism per se as it did with the Church's authority. The king resented the Pope's authority over his, Henry VIII's, English subjects. Now I'll read from someone else's work. The 37 years of his reign transformed England more deeply than perhaps he imagined or desired. He thought to replace the Pope while leaving unchanged the old faith that had habituated the people to moral restraints and obedience to law. But his successful defiance of the papacy, his swift dispersal of monks and relics, his repeated humiliation of the clergy, his appropriation of church property, and his secularization of the government so weakened ecclesiastical prestige and authority as to invite the theological changes that followed in the reigns of Edward, the next king, and Elizabeth, 3 monarchs removed from the time of Henry. In other words, he does not want to do away with Roman Catholicism. He wants to do away with the reaching hand of influence of the Pope down in the Vatican. He wants Roman Catholicism to stay intact in England. But Henry wants to be the head of the church, though. He wants to substitute an absolute monarchy for papal infallibility. He wants to be the head of the church. But because he seems to throw off so many of his Roman Catholic restraints, then that pretty much just paves the way for the radical Reformation change that will happen in England somewhat during the time of Edward. I say somewhat because it was only temporary. His half-sister Mary just destroys everything that Edward had attempted to do, and then radically so by Queen Elizabeth whenever she comes to the throne, as I said, in the end of the 6th decade of the 16th century. The English Reformation was less doctrinal than the German, the Martin Luther, the Lutheran Reformation. It was more political here. But one outstanding result was the same, the victory of the state over the church. The people escaped from an infallible pope into the arms of an absolute king. So really you have the same thing, in other words, is what he's arguing here. To escape from the clutches of an infallible pope to an absolute king, you have the same thing as far as authority is concerned. But Henry wanted the authority to be invested in himself. Now back to my own notes. Henry had 6 wives. He didn't have 8. because the kings and queens aren't named 6th or 7th or 8th depending on the number of marriages. But Henry VIII had 6 wives, several ending up on the chopping block, and all trying to produce a male heir to the throne, which is really why he went through so many wives. He couldn't seem to get a male heir. He got girls, but he wanted boys. Edward was the only product as far as a male heir is concerned. Edward was the only product, but he was a sickly one at that. He came to the throne at the age of 10. See, I didn't specify this last time. Whenever we talk about a new king in England, don't think of a full-grown bearded man or something. He's a boy. He's a sick little 10-year-old boy, who, of course, the country will be ruled by his counselors through him, or from him through his counselors, I might say. The country will be ruled. He ruled until the age of 15. He ruled 6 years, and then he died as a sick boy. So in one sense, we could say Henry VIII really never had any male children, because this child really didn't work out. But Edward was a staunch Protestant. Whence his Protestantism, we might ask. He was raised and educated by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was himself a staunch Protestant, although he was the Archbishop of Canterbury during the time of Henry VIII, who was a staunch Roman Catholic. But here is how and why we're going to have a change now from Catholicism to Protestantism, because Edward certainly hasn't picked these things up from his father Henry. But as you probably already know, in the court of the kings and queens, many times the children are not raised by their parents. They're raised by counselors, by tutors, and by other teachers. So he is raised by Cranmer, who himself was, of course, a staunch Protestant, and then he comes to the throne in 1547. Now, whenever he comes to the throne, although probably most of the people are still Catholic, maybe most of the churches are still Catholic in control and in thought and in heart, a lot of changes do take place because of the influence that Cranmer manifests through the new king. To again return to someone else's writings, Anabaptists and Unitarians crossed the channel to preach in England heresies that shocked Protestants as much as Catholics. You see, whenever you destroy the religious, ecclesiastical, official authority of the church, it seems just to open up the way for all sects to enter in. Iconoclast crowds in London removed crucifixes and paintings and statues from the churches. Nicholas Ridley, principal of Pembroke College, Cambridge, preached powerfully against religious images and holy water. And to cap it all, Archbishop Cranmer did eat meat openly in Lent, the like of which was never seen since England was a Christian country. The Royal Council thought this was going too far, but Somerset overruled it and gave reform its head. Under his lead, Parliament in 1547 ordered that every picture on church wall or window commemorating a prophet, apostle, or saint should be extirpated, so that there should remain no memory of the same. Most of the stained glass in the churches was destroyed. Most of the statues were crushed. Crucifixes were replaced with royal arms. Whitewashed walls and stainless windows took over the color of the religion of England. There was a general scramble in each locality for church silver and gold, and in 1551 the government appropriated what remained. The magnificent medieval cathedrals barely remained. And he goes on to say, and the leading spirit in this all was Archbishop Cranmer. A wonderful sort of sects swarming everywhere came into the country, not only of papists, but of Arians, Anabaptists, and all other heretics. Some denying the Holy Ghost to be God, some denying original sin, some denying predestination, innumerable such like, too long to be recited. Roger Hutchinson wrote of Sadducees and libertines who say that the devil is nothing but a filthy affection of the flesh, that there is no place of rest or pain after this life, that hell is nothing but tormenting and desperate consciences in people, and that a joyful, quiet, and merry conscience is heaven. So there's no such thing as the reality of heaven and hell. It's all in your own mind. There's no devil. There's no Christ. He's not divine. And all of these things then enter into the church. Utilizing the liberty that had been granted by Somerset, a reckless fringe among the Protestants satirized the old religion heartlessly. Oxford students parodied the Mass in their farces, chopped missals to pieces, snatched consecrated bread from the altar, and trampled it underfoot. London preachers call priests imps of the whore of Babylon, that is, the Pope. Businessmen met for conferences in St. Paul's, and young gallants gathered there and fought and slew. The new protectorate was now definitely Protestant. So that just shows you the radical change that takes place in England between the death of Henry and the accession to the throne of his son, Edward VI. So let's pick up with that, having given you a little, the first few moments here, political background. Let's pick up again with Bible translations. Now, the last one we covered in the most recent message fit under the reign of Edward, and that was the work of Sir John Cheek that came out in 1550. He was the one who wanted to use terms which were of only English origin, thus rendering proselyte as freshman and resurrection as uprising and regeneration as gain birth and foreigners as Welshmen and so forth. And so this morning then we come to a second one. We're going to fit three relatively insignificant ones in between the Great Bible and the next significant one we discuss. The second one this morning then will be the work of Bishop Edmund Becke, B-E-C-K-E. The work of Bishop Edmund Becke, which comes out 1 year after Cheek's, B-E-C-K-E, therefore in 1551. I just wanted you to know, remember if you already knew, to know if you didn't know before, that Edward is quite a bit different than Henry, and Henry was influenced by his wives, but that he remained a Catholic at heart nonetheless. Now, Beck's translation is essentially Taverner's Old Testament and Tyndale's New Testament, if I could just sum it up here in a sentence. It was essentially Taverner's Old Testament and Tyndale's New Testament, which were put together by John Day, D-A-Y-E, but revised and edited by Becke. I think you might could spell his name Edmund as double E-D-M-U-N-D or just one E-D-M-U-N-D, but you probably have it one E anyway, Edmund Becke. So Day puts together essentially Taverner's Old Testament and Tyndale's New, and then Becke, and therefore we credit the Bible to him, and his name is attached to it, revised and edited it. And Becke also gave a retranslation of several of the apocryphal books, where he actually does the translating work himself. And those books from the Apocrypha, which he retranslated, were First Esdras, Tobit, and Judith. And then for the first time, he translated Third Maccabees. And we were familiar with First and Second from the Apocrypha, and there's more. Remember, there's about 5 Maccabees. And for the first time, we have Third Maccabees appearing in English, translated in in Edmund Becke's Bible. Now, he provides a dedication to the king in the beginning of it, and in the dedication, he has a very interesting prescription for holiness among English Christians of this day, middle of the 16th century. Here was his prescription for holiness among English Christians. If they will read my Bible but 1 hour per day, this will stop all blaspheming and swearing and card playing, plus riots, licentiousness, and pride. Well, I wish it were that easy. Read a chapter a day and keep the devil away. But it doesn't exactly work that way. But he said if they'll read the Bible 1 hour per day, it'll stop all blaspheming, swearing, card playing. How do you like that one slipped in there? It'll stop all card playing, plus riots, licentiousness, and pride. Now, maybe his Bible is best known for the notes that it includes. He does give us some marginal notes, which happen to be printed in the same type as the text itself. Now that presents a problem. Notes in Bibles cause enough problems without being printed in the same type as the text itself for lay people, because lay people often equate the notes with the Scripture. That's why it's probably a good recommendation that people don't use as their regular Bible a note-filled Bible, a study Bible, if you will, because that's just a common tendency among lay people where they equate the notes at the bottom of the page or in the center column reference or in the margins. They equate the notes with the Scripture itself, and then they'll start quoting things to you, and before you know it, they're quoting Schofield to you. Or they're quoting date to you. And you want the Bible, and they got confused. They know they read that in the Bible. No, but I found that in the Bible, they'll say. Well, that's right. They found in the Bible, but it was a footnote written by C.I. Schofield or by Dake in there, and it wasn't really part of the text itself. So I don't have a problem with study Bibles as long as they're used for study purposes to look at the notes, and don't pack them with you everywhere and quote out of them all the time. Because many have been the times where people have quoted Schofield instead of Paul or Isaiah. And here we are going to have a double problem on our hands. Not only do we have notes here in the Bible, no big problem, but as I say, lay people tend to equate that with the Scripture itself, but the notes are printed in the same type, the same type as what you'd have on your page in your Bible, the same type as the text itself, which only heightened the problem then for the lay people. You say, well, why would that really be a problem with Beck's, holy Bible that he has? Well, some of the notes are objectionable. They're objectionable. We've got some problems with some of his notes, and people are going to read these and equate them with Scripture, and they'll go away from this thinking, now, this is what God has said. For instance, here we have a famous example from 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. And his note was, he that dwelleth with his wife according to knowledge, that taketh her as a necessary helper, and not as a bondservant or bondslave, and if she be not obedient and helpful unto him, endeavoreth to beat, emphasis is mine, the fear of God into her head, that thereby she may be compelled to learn her duty and to do it. Well, that's probably rather typical of England during this period of history. But it's really not an appropriate note to find in the Bible. See, 1 Peter 3:7, I just read it. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. And he said, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel. And rather than give us that and leave us with that, he says if she's not obedient and helpful unto him, then he should endeavor to beat the fear of God into her head, that thereby she may be compelled to learn her duty and to do it. I'm sure he's the same one that must have invented that little catchy phrase that every husband wants a wife that'll think like a man, act like a woman, and will work like a dog. Probably that was point B into 1 Peter 3:7. I guess it has some merit to it. Every husband does seem to want a wife that will think like a man. But in one sense, that's almost idolizing, making an idol of the husband, to make the wife in the image of the husband then. But anyway, we won't bog down on that one too long. The notes, I might add, were not reprinted in any later editions. He says if you can't get her to obey, then he should endeavor to beat the fear of God into her head, that thereby she may be compelled to learn her duty and to do it. Well, men sometimes get a little exasperated with their wives. And he said if you don't have an obedient wife, then the thing to do is take a switch to her and teach her the word and teach her how to haul those pails of water in and out of the house. And if she complains about it, then beat the fear of God, the fear of her husband into her then. So I don't think 1 Peter 3:7 would really be an appropriate place for that. I think you'd better find another verse, because this one actually says, give honor unto the wife. Don't beat her skull then, but give honor unto the wife. So you'd probably better find, maybe Ephesians 5, where it said, wives, obey your husband. Or jump up earlier here in 1 Peter, where it said in verse 6 that Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. That would be a verse there, that Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Because then verse 7 almost switches back in favor of the wife, whereas earlier it seems like it's been in favor of the husband. So he probably really attached the note at the wrong place here. But maybe you're married to the perfect husband that doesn't want you to think like a man, act like a woman, and work like a dog. Think like a man, because he's got problems with the way you think sometimes. Give a woman a map and tell her to drive somewhere, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now, I haven't seen too many exceptions to that. I've even heard stories of some of the best of the women in our church and how they got to where they arrived in a very unusual, interesting way. I've even taken directions from some women here, and you just as soon consult a crystal ball as to take some directions from some people how to get somewhere. I remember not long ago, someone, a blessed womanly saint in the church here, was describing where a certain thing was, and, well, you turn left and then right, and then it's over here, and then, and I knew right where she was talking about, so I said, oh, it's right here. Oh, no, it's not there. That's the wrong part. It's over here. And then I went and showed my wife, well, see, they don't know how to give directions at all. You soon consult a crystal ball as to take directions from. A few exceptions, but as I say, I've heard stories of even the best of the women here. But I guess that's because women are women and men are men. They just drive by emotion. If the Spirit says turn left, they turn left. If the Spirit says that the sun rises in the north, it just rises in the north. Period. They're really confused on a cloudy day then, if they even know where the sun rises. And so then the husband wants her to act like a woman, feminine, be feminine. Well, how can she be feminine when she thinks like a man and works like a dog? And you're wanting her to act like a woman. But as the saying says, that man works from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. And there's a lot of truth to that. Work like a dog. Someone's got to do it. Get out there. This is what Beck was arguing for, I'm sure. I remember whenever I was growing up, my father would head for the bedroom, and he'd say, dear, it's time to go to bed. I'm coming. Just one more thing I've got to do.
That's right.
Now, that wasn't my mother that responded. But then, an hour and 1,000 snores later, there she comes in. And my wife has done that. I'll say, it's time to go to bed. Let me vacuum first. I want to vacuum real quickly. And I think, who's going to be looking at our carpet during the middle of the night? You're vacuuming for the mice. Their argument is, but I'll get a jump on tomorrow, though. Well, the only way you get a jump on tomorrow is go to bed early the night before. That's the way you get a jump. Well, a little humor to make Bible translations worth their study. I remember one more story. Back in our old home in Minnesota, I had a study down in the basement. We didn't have any children then, and I would be studying down there, and all day I would hear my wife cleaning the house upstairs. It didn't need cleaning. She cleaned it the day before, but I guess she didn't have anything else to do, and I'd hear the furniture being dragged all around the house. And I'd always come upstairs, what in the world is going on up here? This house there's not a speck of dirt anywhere in this house. Why don't you do something else besides clean the house? And now when they get so many children, you have to help them clean now. You wish some of that could be imputed for the years to come in the future. Women should think like a man, act like a woman, and work like a dog. I've never forgotten that. That's one of those things you don't forget once you hear it the first time. If you're a female and you forget, your husband will remind you. It's really an impossible role a woman has to fulfill, to think like a man so her husband doesn't become exasperated over her, but to be feminine, but to be working all the time. You're in a strait betwixt three in a case like that. Now, well, anyway, the royal scene is about to change in England. Edward is a sickly boy. He only reigns for 6 years, from the time he's 10 until the time he's 15. And the years of Edward's rule are fairly prosperous for the cause of Protestantism. He rules from 1547 to 1553. His half-sister, Mary Tudor, comes to the throne in 1553, and the reforming policies are reversed. Now, we may say a little more later. I can never tell. Forgive me if I say we're not going to discuss the political scene, and the next week I come back and say, now let's discuss the political scene. That just means I change my mind somewhere in between the Sundays or the teachings. We may discuss more of Mary's reign later. I don't know. There was one woman who had a short 10-day reign after the end of Edward's life and before Mary came to the throne, but that's really not important at all. Whenever Mary comes to the throne in 1553, for the first year and a half, maybe 2 years, the rule is relatively quiet. We don't have big problems as far as Mary is concerned. But by the year 1555, to be sure, Mary's reign changes drastically. It becomes more forthright and antagonistic. And she has become known in history as Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary, why? Well, because of the deaths she caused during her life. I suppose that her father, Henry VIII, could be called Bloody Henry as well, because he executed many of his wives, or had them executed. But this woman has become known in history as Bloody Mary. Both John Rogers, who went by the pseudonym Thomas Matthew in Matthew's Bible, John Rogers and Thomas Cranmer were martyred during her rule. Cromwell has fallen from power and executed by the King Henry VIII several years earlier. I forget what year that was. 1540, I believe, Cromwell. I'm not for sure on that, but I believe 1540 Cromwell was executed by the king. Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, is martyred during Mary's rule. John Rogers is martyred also. John Rogers, as a matter of fact, was the first of the Marian martyrs. You can go back to your lit tape 156, where I made reference to this. When we talked about Matthew's Bible and John Rogers, lit tape 156. I added a little historical note that John Rogers was the first of the Marian martyrs, and now we're up to the time of Bloody Mary. Coverdale is still alive, remember, during this whole time. He does Coverdale's Bible, and he did the Great Bible. Coverdale barely escapes with his life to the continent through the intercession of the powerful King of Denmark, who was a friend of his. So Coverdale, thankfully, is going to remain alive. Rogers dies, Cranmer dies, Tyndall has died as a martyr earlier, Wycliffe died posthumously as a martyr, if that makes any sense. His bones were exhumed and burned and thrown in the Swift River. Coverdale barely escapes to the continent through the intercession of the powerful King of Denmark, a friend of his. Bloody Mary reinstitutes in a full-fledged fashion all of the policies of Roman Catholicism, persecutes, imprisons, yes, even kills martyrs, the Protestant leaders. Many died during her rule. I think maybe 2 people died during Edward's rule, to give you a statistic on that. There were 2 martyrs, and of course they would be Catholic martyrs during Edward's rule, Protestant martyrs during Mary's rule. But even with all of the problems that Mary brings to the English throne, there's no hint, either through the Queen or Parliament, of any type of ban on Bibles. You would think that would be one thing that she would do, but there's no hint, either through the Queen or Parliament, of any type of ban on Bibles, their circulation, their publication, or their reading. Why would there be no ban on this? Well, let me give you an interesting statistic about Mary that you might not have known. The fact that she's the queen of the martyrs, queen who martyrs them. The fact that that's true has probably been blown so out of proportion that we don't know anything else about her life. All we think of her as is Bloody Mary. But she was a scholar, believe it or not, in her own right, a Greek scholar in her own right. And through and with the help of her chaplain, she had a hand in translating John's Gospel for the Great Bible. She was the translator of the Gospel of John for the Great Bible during her father's reign, Henry VIII. See, you would never have guessed that a woman, and a Catholic at that, and a bloody one at that, would be responsible for the translation of a whole book, and such a good one as that, John's Gospel, for the New Testament of the Great Bible during her father's reign. But the evidence appears to point toward that. She had some help with her chaplain, from her chaplain, but she was a Greek scholar in her own right. So that then gives us the political transition from Edward's rule, and all this is taking place in 1553, to the reign of Mary. And she's only going to rule for 5 years, until 1558. And so as we jump into Mary's rule, let's move on to our third and our last of these minor translations that we want to discuss. And this is Whittingham's New Testament. It's just a New Testament. We've looked at Cheek's, we've looked at Edmund Beck's. This is William Whittingham's New Testament. Mary comes to the throne in 1553. She rules to 1558. No English works of Bible translation come out during the beginning years of her reign. Whittingham's New Testament is reserved for its appearance toward the end of Mary's rule, around 1557. But of course, the work certainly couldn't have been done in England, could it? Because there's all this persecution of Protestants there. So now we're going to have to jump over to the continent, as we've done once before, or really more than once before, but one significant time before. We're going to have to jump over to the continent for the actual translation of this work. Mary's persecution has caused the surviving Protestant scholars to flee to the continent. And many of them go to the city of Geneva, which was a magnet center of attraction for Protestants during this era. John Calvin had made this city famous. John Knox, who now is living here, felt that he found, I quote, the most perfect school of Christ, end of quote, here in Geneva since the days of the apostles. Calvin, by the way, is still alive now. Calvin is still alive and still living here during this time. Theodore Beza, Calvin's friend, and probably the greatest living biblical scholar, also had close ties to the city. And so with the presence of people like John Calvin, John Knox, and Theodore Beza, B-E-Z-A, all of them luminary and heavyweight names as far as the Protestant cause is concerned, then the city of Geneva would obviously prove to be a perfect place for the English reformers, the English Bible translators, to get started on their work. Calvin has tried to turn the city, as I read a quote from Knox, the most perfect school of Christ, Calvin has tried to turn the city into a theocracy. And in essence he does, and we'll study that someday, what the city of Geneva was all about and like during the time of Calvin. But he essentially attempts to turn it into a theocracy. A theocracy that in some regards is similar to the theonomists today. You remember what I shared with you a few weeks ago, one weeknight, about Reconstructionism, and they want to impose the laws, the Old Testament laws of God back on society, and so execute the adulterers and the homosexuals and on all of this. And they had the same beliefs here in the city of Geneva. Very similar hermeneutics in interpreting some of those passages in the Old Testament. And much of that, I think, to the shame of people like Calvin. And Calvin was a difficult, well, I won't get into Calvin. I better not get into that. But he was a famous theologian and scholar, but he had many personal problems in his attitude and his ethics, I think. He was an irascible type individual, very cantankerous, and insisted on the fact that everyone agree with him. And if not, some people were, like Michael Servetus, were burned at the stake. French scholars are already at work on a revision of the French Bible in Geneva. Geneva's in Switzerland. But Calvin, of course, is a Frenchman. He was born in France. People from all over the continent now, as well as the British Isles, are flocking to Geneva. It's just the Protestant stronghold of this day. It's a magnet center of attraction. And French scholars are already at work on a revision of the French Bible during this time. Beza, who also was a Frenchman, a French scholar, had done much to establish the correct New Testament text. I called him a moment ago the greatest living biblical scholar. You say, well, wasn't he alive during the time of Calvin, and wouldn't you rank Calvin higher than Beza? Not as a biblical scholar. As a theologian, yes. But those are two really entirely different things. Calvin was a theologian. Beza was a biblical scholar. He could really deal with the biblical text and the manuscripts and bring all the variants together and deduce from the variants which should be right and which should be thrown out. We discussed Beza's work in the Greek text on lit tape number 42. Probably is where you were introduced to Theodore Beza. But Beza's working on a French Bible, and he's going to help a little bit with the work that he's done as far as correcting the text of the New Testament. That will spill over for the benefit of the English reformers and translators as well. So essentially, the Englishmen just borrowed from the Frenchmen, is what I'm saying. The Englishmen are essentially borrowing from the Frenchmen, and most notably Theodore Beza. Therefore, Whittingham's New Testament is going to be pretty much based on Theodore Beza's textual work of reconstruction. Now, the important man for this cause is William Whittingham, a former fellow at All Souls College of Oxford. Over there they loved those names, and they still love them in Episcopal churches. All Souls this and All Souls that. But he was a former fellow at All Souls College of Oxford, and he was the successor to John Knox as pastor of the English church in Geneva. There would be many different churches which spoke different languages in Geneva. It was a melting pot. William Whittingham was the successor to John Knox as pastor of the English church in Geneva. And here's something I want to maybe clear up. This goes back to lit tape 42. There has been a lot of speculation over the relationship between William Whittingham and John Calvin. Now, most of the material that I have read will inform you that William Whittingham was the brother-in-law to John Calvin, that he married John Calvin's sister. And I think that I stated this on lit tape 42. The more I look at that, and I'm still not for sure, and I don't know if others are or not, maybe someone who's really an expert in all of this is, but the more I look at it, it appears that he may have married Calvin's sister-in-law, which would make them no relation at all. He may have married Calvin's sister-in-law rather than Calvin's sister. It seems like that there was an erroneous old memorial inscription that served as the source for the false belief that's been produced in many, many books for years now, that Whittingham was married to the sister of John Calvin, so he was his brother-in-law. It seems like this was due to an erroneous old memorial inscription that stated that Whittingham married Catherine, which was the name of John Calvin's sister, Catherine. But it appears that this is true, and I'm not for certain, but I just want, if I was wrong on lit tape 42, I want to clear it up now. If he did marry someone named Catherine, it was Calvin's sister-in-law and not Calvin's sister. Okay, in any regard, I don't think that proves a whole lot one way or the other, because regardless of who he married, he and Calvin knew one another, because they're both living in Geneva at this time. So that seems to be the bottom line anyway. Did Calvin and Whittingham, were they related? Did they know each other? They were related, and they knew each other in the sense that they live in the same city together, and they're both reformers, Protestant reformers working for the cause of Protestantism. They're obviously not related by blood. If they're related by marriage, well, maybe, but that appears not to be the case. So, anyway, in 1557, Whittingham prints his revision of the English New Testament, which is somewhat similar to Matthew's revision of Tyndale, along with the influence of Beza's French Bible, as I've said. There are some other influences. That wasn't the only influence, maybe the most direct one. But somewhat influenced by Matthew's revision of Tyndale, with some changes introduced by the Great Bible, and with Beza's 1556 Latin New Testament. Beza did Latin and Greek. So there's a fourfold influence, or five if you separate Matthew from Tyndale. Matthew, his revision of Tyndale, which would give us Tyndale as 2, changes from the Great Bible 3, Beza's 1556 Latin New Testament 4, Beza's French work, being done in Geneva at this time, 5. Several different influences, but it seems to be chiefly Matthew's Bible and Beza's work. Okay, the features of Whittingham's New Testament. First of all, it was a small octavo edition with Roman type. A small octavo edition with Roman type. And for the first time, italics are supplied for the English sense in the verses, which has been carried down in modern versions today. Like the KJV, you have italicized words there. Well, they're not in the Greek or the Hebrew, but they're supplied to fill in the sense, the English sense of the sentence that was maybe not so directly expressed in Greek or Hebrew, or that maybe cannot be so directly translated into English, but will supply the sense anyway. And yet italicized to show us that those words were in fact not in the original. Secondly, his New Testament was divided up into verses. Now again, note Lit Tape 42. You can go back and compare. Look for your notes on Lit Tape 42. This was the first English New Testament to divide the New Testament's verses up as we have them today. This was the first in English New Testaments, 1557, to be divided by verse in numeration as we have. It's based on the 4th edition of the Greek New Testament by Robert Stephanus, which came out in 1551, 6 years earlier. And this is all discussed, briefly anyway, some of it in more detail on Lit Tape 42. So I just cross-reference that, and I don't have to teach that message twice then. New Testament divided into verses. This is a first in English New Testaments. It comes from the 4th edition of the Greek 1551 New Testament of Robert Stephanus. He also goes by another last name that we gave you on that tape, but that's his generally known name. Another feature, in the third place, the term church is used instead of Tyndale's and Coverdale's congregation. They have gone back and forth between church and congregation. Congregation seems to emphasize the people. Church seems to emphasize the institution. Or we could say, in one sense, we could say the leaders. Congregation emphasizes the people, because we would think of congregation as being everyone in the church building except the one speaking, except the pastor. That would be the congregation. Church seems to emphasize the ecclesiastical nature and the authority of the group. And of course, church was picked up by KJV, and they used church and not congregation. Either one is acceptable. Assembly is acceptable. A gathering is acceptable. Either one is acceptable, but different words, as you can already see from church and congregation, carry different connotations. Another feature I might add was an introductory epistle by John Calvin. An introductory epistle that stated that Christ is the end of the law, Romans 10:4. Christ is the end of the law. Christ's suretyship, as some people refer to that verse as. Romans 10:4. The suretyship of Christ. So here Calvin actually has his work, of all things, in an English Bible. We know that he did his dealings in Latin and in Greek, but he could also do some dealings in English as well. Now this would be a popular, prevalent thing to have in the Bible of a reformer, that Christ is the end of the law. In other words, it would be an emphasis on justification by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. So he would be developing, as we've come across before, the Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith. And you'd want to develop that right in the front of the Bible, because Christians would be reading that. And you'd want them to read that Bible through the right colored glasses. Read it through the eyes of justification by faith and not the work salvation of the Romanists. Another feature, Paul does not appear as the author in the title to the book of Hebrews. Paul does not appear as the author in the title of the book of Hebrews. So here in our King James Bible, we have the epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews. So here's the first English Bible where the name of Paul is dropped as the author of Hebrews. And they explain that by the following: seeing the Spirit of God. They kind of get into the heavenly realm here. Some man had to write it. But seeing the Spirit of God is the author thereof. It diminishes nothing the authority, although we know not with what pen he wrote it. Because they felt that if people now opened to Hebrews and found Paul's name to be absent, then that would detract from the authority of the book then, since we don't know who wrote it. And they said, in fact, we don't know, as far as a human author is concerned. Seeing the Spirit of God is the author thereof. As long as we know that, they said, it diminishes nothing the authority, although we know not with what pen he wrote it. Which is about where we are today with the study of the book of Hebrews. That's about as good a quote as you can get. We know the Spirit of God is the author of it. What vessel he worked through, we don't know. Another feature, and a final one for this morning. For the first time, the latter epistles of the New Testament are called general epistles instead of Catholic epistles, which was a carryover from the Vulgate. Now, there was nothing wrong with Catholic, it just meant universal, that these epistles dealt with more general or universal themes. General epistles would be things like Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, James. They're not specific like some of Paul's epistles, and those would be classed with the Pauline corpus anyway as Pauline documents. But English Bibles up until this time had referred to these latter New Testament epistles as Catholic epistles, because that term was a carryover from the Vulgate. And again, it has nothing to do with Roman Catholicism, because the word simply means universal or general, which is all that the word Roman Catholic means, which I think I've said before is really a contradiction of terms for it to be Roman Catholic, because Rome is one place and then Catholic means universal or everywhere. So it's really a contradiction of terms. So we have Whittingham's Bible, which is the only, or New Testament, which is the only significant work that's appearing during the reign of Mary, 1 year before she is deposed in 1557. So it's toward the end of her reign. And it's the only English work that's being done during her reign. Now, as I say, later we may pick up more with her reign, or since pretty much by now we're past that, from now on we'll be into the reign of Elizabeth. So we will have to discuss Elizabeth next time, when she comes to the throne in 1558, reigns all the way to 1603, has a long, monumental rule in England. And this is a period of all of the classical work being done in writing and so forth in England, the Elizabethan age of English literature. And we have many important Bibles done during that time. We'll pick up with that next week.